Hunt. Riding Hood Retold. A tale in the romance, a medieval fairy tale series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. Once upon a time, a king fell in love with the goddess of love. They were very happy together, and she bore him a son. Though he had many older sons by his previous wives, she wanted him to name this child his heir. But the king did not. This king worshipped an ancient god of the forest, who had protected his kingdom for generations, and he prayed daily at the god's altar. One day, when he was at his prayers, his goddess wife came to find him. Instead of praying like he usually did, the king had her son lying on top of the altar, and the king beseeched his god to take the boy as his servant, to better protect the kingdom. The goddess was incensed. The boy was hers, he did not belong to some god of trees, so she snatched the child up in her arms. Only to discover that the boy no longer drew breath. The king had sacrificed him to his barbaric god, who relished such things. She raised her hand to strike the king dead, as he had struck her son, but the king's youngest son, whose mother had died birthing him, came running in and wrapped himself about the queen's legs, for he saw her as the only mother he had known and loved both her and his little brother dearly. The king feared for his son and begged for the boy's life. The queen, not just a goddess but a powerful sorceress too, called down a terrible storm. The raging winds destroyed the palace, and lightning struck each of the king's sons, killing them instantly. All but the youngest, who she allowed to live. The king she turned into a white wolf, so pale the shepherds of his flocks instantly saw him coming, and chased him away until he vanished into the deep woods, high into the mountains. The youngest son became king, building a new capital closer to the trade routes, and he ushered in a time of great prosperity for the kingdom, because he was greatly favored by both his father's god and the goddess of love, his stepmother. She favored him so much that she allowed him to marry one of her own daughters by her new lover, and both king and queen were very happy and had many children. But the old king, the white wolf, he stayed in the mountains, hidden from humans, until the worst winter snows covered the towns. Only then would he venture out, his white fur blending perfectly with the snow as he hunted for the enchantress who had killed his sons. But did he ever find her, grandmother? Rosa asked. Grandmother flashed an enigmatic smile. The tales never say, so I suppose he did not. Perhaps his time came and he died, and that's where his story ends. Rosa wrinkled her nose. Or perhaps it is nothing more than a tale, and this king never truly lived at all. Perhaps, grandmother agreed. She glanced out the window, where the late afternoon light was already turning the shutters rosy. But it never hurts to be careful, especially on your way home through the forest. Practice your magic too on your way. I'm not sure what will fall first, snow or night, but you'd best be home before both. And don't forget to take the medicine for Edda. She might not last the winter, but we must help her all we can to see the spring. Rosa thought of the ancient woman, who never left her cottage now. Edda has seen many springs already. What good is one more? Another enigmatic smile. When it might be your last, you will always fight for one more. One more season, one more day, perhaps even one more minute, for a lot can be said in that time. But I pray it is a long time before you know the truth of it in your heart. Now go home, child, and don't forget your cloak, for you will need it in the snow. Yes, grandmother. Rosa lifted the brand new cloak her grandmother had given her only hours before, and flung it around her shoulders. The fine red wool hung heavily, so that none but the strongest gust of wind could disturb it. It was the cloak of a lady or a princess, not a carpenter's daughter. All her other cloaks had been brown to match her humble station. To wear something so rich and vibrant seemed to scream for attention from the very heavens themselves. The village needs to see you for what you are, for one day when I am gone you will be their witch, and they will need to know who to come to, grandmother said, as if reading her thoughts. If she was simply a healer, a woman who knew her herbs, it would be fine, But if the town knew her magic was the elemental kind and far more powerful than her grandmother's, Rosa gulped. The other girls already thought her strange. If they knew what she could do. Be off with you, child. And practice. Grandmother shooed her out of the house. 2. For the first time in his life, Chase didn't know what to do. Now Major was gone, and Abraham too. He was all alone in the world. But one thing was certain, the king had made it clear he could not stay here. So he would depart. Chase sold Abraham's horse for a good price and tucked the coins into the pouch at his waist. He had enough money to get him to almost any kingdom in the civilized world, and for the first time in his life, he was free to choose who he served. King Eric's court in Arros was famed for its tourneys, and he could win any archery contest with his eyes closed. Perhaps it was time to aim high and attach himself to a royal court, to see how his fortunes fared there. Better than his brother's fortune, he'd wager, for Heber's land was not so fruitful of late, or so his last letter had said. Yes, he would go to Arros. There was nothing left for him here. So Chase mounted his mare and set off on his quest for fame and fortune. 3. Rosa hurried home. She told herself it was because of the lateness of the hour, but in her heart she knew the truth. Her wild imagination had been so caught up in her grandmother's tale that more than once, she fancied she saw a shadow lurking behind the trees, following her home. She tried to distract herself by practicing, as her grandmother had said, but her magic didn't seem to want to cooperate today. Snow started falling too, and she couldn't be sure if the flurries were her powers at work, or the natural movement of the breeze. Snow already lay thick on the ground in the village by the time she reached it. She reached for the door of her family's cottage. "Lul, I told you to put down your sewing and cut up the vegetables for the soup," Mother scolded. "Why can't Rosa do it?" Lul whined. "Because she's still at your grandmother's, and if the snow keeps falling like this, she might not be home until morning. Your father's bringing fresh straw for our beds, and as soon as he gets home, I'll be busy dealing with that. Do you want supper or don't you?" "Yes, Mother." Rosa drew her hand back under her cloak. She hated cutting onions, and there were always so many for the soup. Let Lul do it for once. Rosa could take her grandmother's package to Edda in the meantime. Maybe when she came back, the soup would be ready and she wouldn't have to make it this time. 4. So Chase rode through the gates, sparing a nod of approval for the stout construction of the King of Arros castle. The thickness of the walls spoke of the kingdom's strength, while the gaily colored clothing of those who walked within its walls whispered of wealth. Service here would suit him well. A groom appeared to take care of his horse, and Chase dismounted. He lingered long enough to throw his saddlebags over his own shoulder, before allowing the beast to be led off. He'd heard the telltale thwack of arrows in the practice range, and he fancied taking a shot of his own. One that would reach the ears of the queen. In one gate, out another, and he found the practice field, where a trio of men-at-arms took their turns at a target. They certainly needed the practice. None had managed to hit more than the outer circle of the target. Chase's father would not have tolerated such sloppy shots, especially at that distance. Why, he stood 3 times the distance as they did from the target, and he had the perfect shot. His bow was off his back and in his hands before he'd finished the thought. He strung it with the ease of practice, and plucked an arrow from his quiver. He drew, sighted, breathed and loosed, his thoughts following the arrow's flight between the 3 men, then across the field to sink squarely into the center of the target. Exclamations of horror came from the men as they turned to find the source of the arrow, which turned to words of wonder at the size of his bow and the strength it must take to wield it. Chase held it out. "Here, you try," he offered. The bow was taller than the man who took it from him. But Chase thought the stocky guard might have the strength to draw it, all the same. A pleasant afternoon of archery ensued. Chase could definitely get used to this. Maybe even call Arros home. The sound of a throat clearing drew Chase's attention and that of his companions. "Sir Knight, Her Majesty Queen Margarita requests your presence at dinner in the Great Hall," the herald said. Chase grinned. "I'd be honored. Is there anywhere I might bathe and make myself presentable to greet Her Majesty?" "An apartment has been prepared. Follow me, Sir Knight." "It's Chase." "Sir Chase," Chase said. The herald breathed a sigh of relief. "Sir Chase. Whence have you come, Sir Chase?" Chase considered. Who knew how far word had spread about Abraham? He did not dare risk it. "I have traveled from lands so far away I doubt you have heard of them," he said grandly. The herald's eyes widened. "Are you a crusader, sir? Or have you come from the Holy Land? Have you fought in many battles?" Chase chose the truth. Many battles indeed. Fought with his brothers and Abraham in the courtyard with sticks and then swords. Abraham had always bested him with a sword. But he would miss the man, brother in all but blood. "His Majesty King Eric is fond of tales of battle. Perhaps he will ask you to regale us at dinner," the herald said. "I fear I am no bard or teller of tales. I speak best with sword and bow," Chase said. The herald led the way inside. "Then you must tell what you can to one of the Queen's bards, so that he may tell the tale." "Tell Abraham's story? Who would believe it?" Chase himself barely believed it, and he'd seen most of it with his own eyes. Enough to know the truth when Abraham had told him the rest. He only had to look at his tawny armor to be reminded, for after many jugs of ale, he persuaded Abraham to lay his hands on the well-crafted leather. Now it was as beautiful as it was useless, for Abraham's warning that gold would be too soft for combat proved only too true. But if it would buy him a place in the royal court of Aros, he would consider his armor a small price to pay. 5. It was nigh on midnight by the time Rosa left Eda's cottage, full of far more than soup. It had been the old woman's name day, and every member of her family had visited her with gifts and blessings. Eda had insisted Rosa eat some of the cakes Eda's toothless maw could no longer devour, and tell her what they tasted like. Then she'd prepared the medicinal tea her grandmother had sent, and read to Eda from the great Bible the Baron himself had sent her. Tales of men rising from the dead, when even the weakest witch knew such things were not possible. Magic could only accomplish so much. When Eda's eyes drifted shut and she began to snore, Rosa dared to close the book and set it back on the table. Rosa wrapped her cloak around herself and set out for home. Halfway there, she wished she'd brought a lantern, for the cloudy sky and blowing snow made it too dark to see, but the wind would have only blown it out. Fortunately, the cold meant everyone kept their fires burning through the night, and enough light peeped through the gaps in the shutters that she could discern the houses. Even if she hadn't lived in the village her whole life, she'd have known her family cottage by the smell of soup. Evidently Lul had made it, with some to spare. She pushed the door open, careful to make as little noise as possible, and closed it behind her. Rosa frowned. The fire burned low in the grate, as though no one had stoked it before going to bed. Strange? And the soup still hung over the coals, bubbling sluggishly. That wasn't normal either. Inside, the smell of soup was so strong it was almost overpowering, but there was a whiff of something else lurking beneath it too. Something rotten. Like the Baron's slaughterhouse close to Midsummer Feast Day. It was late. She could help her mother search for the offending piece of meat in the morning, when it was lighter. Now she should rekindle the fire, set the soup somewhere to cool, then head up to bed. She threw a handful of kindling on the coals, then grabbed a cloth to unhook the cauldron from the fire. She could barely lift it. Why, the cauldron was almost full, as if her family had prepared dinner, then not eaten it. Rosa felt the air behind her shift, almost imperceptibly, and whirled to face whatever had caused it, swinging the cauldron around with her. Soup splashed out, covering the enormous ghostly shape that was there one moment, before it retreated into the darkness again. Rosa seized a torch and thrust it into the fire until the pitch caught, then turned to face whatever it was. Blue eyes burned in the darkness where someone crouched low, ready to spring. Someone or something? "Show yourself," Rosa hissed, hoping she sounded braver than she felt. "I said show yourself, coward." She hadn't imagined it. Something huge and white came soaring out of the shadows. Something with teeth bigger than any human she'd ever seen. Rosa's grip tightened on her torch, splinters digging into her fingers, but she didn't care. The oozing blood would be the monster's undoing, not hers, as she summoned her magic and swung the torch. The flaming end of the torch collided with the creature, and a gust of air came from nowhere, adding power to the blow so that it carried the creature past Rosa and into the fireplace itself, where the flames blazed to life. The creature yelped, then howled as it struggled to get up with its white fur on fire. A streak of orange and white and red, it fled for the door, hitting it with such force that the door flew open, releasing the beast into the blizzard outside. Rosa blinked, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. In her mind's eye, it had been a giant white wolf, like something out of a fairy tale. A scary fairy tale. A red and white wolf, her memory reminded her. The red of blood. Her hand flew to her mouth as the leaping flames lit the scene she hadn't seen until now. A pair of feet stuck out from under the kitchen table, wearing Lul's house slippers. Father lay behind the door, blind eyes staring at the rafters as his hand seemed to reach for his throat, which was no longer there. Mother lay face down behind the woodpile, as if the creature had brought her down as she tried to run. Her neck, too, was a bloody ruin. Beside her was a basket of straw which had started to smoke, sparked by the beast running past her with its fur ablaze. Even as she hesitated, the basket flared up fully, flames licking at the curtains. Rosa's weary mind was slow to make sense of it all. Her family was dead, some giant wolf had killed them, and now her home was on fire. Her home was on fire. And filling with smoke. If she didn't want to join them in death, she had to get out. Now. Coughing, Rosa staggered for the door, pausing only to grab the poker. If the wolf waited for her outside, she'd take the bastard with her to hell for this. But outside there was nothing but clean snow, with no sign of the beast, or anyone else either. "Fire," she coughed out, hoping someone would hear her. "Fire. Help." Doors began to open along the street, spilling light out onto the snow. But it was too late. By the time the sun rose the next day, all that remained of her family home was a burned-out shell, where her family had breathed their last. The other villagers headed home to breakfast and all the normal things they did every day. Rosa knelt in the ashes and swore an oath of vengeance. The beast would die at her hand for what he'd stolen from her. 6. Your Majesties, may I present to you the renowned knight from far-off lands, the hero of countless battles, the mighty Sir Chase, the herald bellowed. Glad his helmet hid his grin at such flowery exaggeration, Chase strode into the hall. His stupid armor turned his usually smooth stride into more of a stiff march, but no one seemed to notice his discomfort. Instead, all they seemed to want to stare, wide-eyed, as though they'd never seen a man in armor before. The king, Eric, Chase reminded himself, rose and announced, "On the morrow we shall hold a tourney so that you may all test your skills against such a legendary hero." Whatever else he said was drowned out by cheers and toasts to the king's health, as the hall erupted on either side of Chase. When Chase finally reached the dais where the king sat, instinct told him to kneel, but he could not. His benighted armor wouldn't let him. "Fool," the queen muttered, as if reading his thoughts. Chase whipped off his helm. A gasp drew his eye from the queen to a girl, a princess perhaps. Further along the high table. She blushed. Definitely a princess, ripe for marriage to some rival kingdom. Before some handsome knight stole her heart and her virtue too. But seducing princesses would have to wait until his place here was assured. Chase bowed from the waist, praying his armor would not slice him in two. "Your Majesty King Eric," he said. "I am honored by your hospitality. I wish only to serve." He knew he should reach for his sword and lay it at the king's feet as he knelt, but even if he could reach his sword, kneeling was beyond him. He thought quickly. "I eagerly await tomorrow's tourney, for what better way to show a man's fighting prowess? Yet there is more to a knight than his sword," he continued. The princess blushed redder than ever. Perhaps she knew more of such things than a maiden should. Then the queen laughed. And he could think of nothing but her. A hush fell over the hall, as it seemed every man there shared his thoughts. Her mocking smile made him wonder once more if the queen could indeed read minds. "Pray continue, Sir Knight." "As you wish, most beautiful queen." He wet his lips. Abraham had been the one with a way with words, especially when it came to women. He racked his brain for something that would impress the queen. A true hero must keep his wits as sharp as his blade. His honor must shine as bright as his armor and never be allowed to tarnish. Chase glimpsed a fly out of the corner of his eye, flicked away by the princess's impatient hand, and inspiration struck. He continued with more confidence, so that if his liege or his lady is plagued by the most enormous monster or the tiniest gnat, he can dispatch it forthwith. He turned to face the princess. "Allow me, your majesty," he said. He reached behind him for his bow, notched an arrow to the string and let it fly. His arrow lodged in one of the tapestries high above the princess's head, missing the fly completely. Not that anyone would know for sure without climbing the wall to examine his arrow. Stupid armor. He had the princess's attention for certain now. But he needed the queen to be equally impressed. A fly circled the queen's head. Chase drew another arrow. He'd only have one shot at this, and his aim had to be perfect. He breathed out and loosed. His arrow arced up over the queen's head, before embedding itself in the wax encrusting a lit candelabra at the back of the dais. The candles wobbled for a moment, but thankfully did not fall. The fly, still unharmed, flew toward the princess, whose eyes met his. If the queen was a mind reader, so was her daughter. And the daughter knew he'd missed the fly twice. He winked at her and said, "Fear not, young maiden. A knight's duty is to save every lady, not just the queen." Chase reached for a third arrow. The fly buzzed back toward the queen. Chase released the arrow just as the queen flicked her fingers to shoo the fly away. His heart leaped into his throat. "By all that was holy, please no." Queen Margarita leaped to her feet. "Guards!" A thin line of blood trickled down the queen's fingers to where the arrow had lodged in the table before her. As if taunting him for his poorly timed shot, a shimmery wing was all that remained of the fly, now squashed under the weight of his arrow. Chase didn't feel the guards seizing his arms, his armor was too thick for that, until the men started to drag him back, out of the hall. No. This was all wrong. He was supposed to impress the queen, not shoot her. "Your Majesty, I meant to rid you of a pest, not?" He was mortified to hear the weakness in his voice. "Begging." "Silence!" Queen Margarita thundered. Chase had never been more relieved to obey a woman's command. At her side, King Eric rose. "Anyone who seeks to harm my queen commits treason. Such a heinous crime is punishable by death." No. He hadn't. He'd wanted to impress her, help her, not harm her. He'd never harm a woman. Never. Why, when his own sister lay dying, begging him to leave her to find her husband, to bring him home, Chase had not been able to release her hand. He'd learned archery so he could defend her. Like he wanted to serve this queen. Not. He's telling the truth. The high, clear voice could only belong to the young princess. She stood eye to eye with the queen over the head of the woman who sat between them. Her nurse Chase presumed, for the woman was trying to make the princess sit down, but the girl was having none of it. He shot a fly. "Look!" The princess pointed. A silent battle raged between mother and daughter. Chase's own life rested on the outcome he knew, but he couldn't think through his fascination at these two compelling women. The queen was formidable, but the princess did not fear her. Whoever the girl married, he'd better not rule a rival kingdom, for that would mean war. Somehow the queen's eyes had moved back to Chase. Her voice was quiet but deadly. "Get out. This once you may leave with your life. Set foot in this kingdom again and you will not be so lucky." The princess had won, but he did not dare risk a glance of thanks in her direction, lest the queen change her mind. He bowed, then fled, leaving his hopes in tatters on the flagstone floor. 7. There she goes. The witch. She murdered her family one midwinter and drank their blood with the devil, and that's where she gets her powers from. Don't look her in the eye or you'll be next. Children shrieked and ran. All but one, a boy of perhaps 9 or 10 years, who dared to look her in the eye. "Witch," he taunted, even as he ignored his own warning. Rosa gritted her teeth, hefting her bag higher on her shoulder, and said nothing. It would be so easy to summon a gust of wind, lift the boy off his feet, and deposit him at the top of the nearest tree, or on the roof of his equally ignorant parents' cottage, but she would not use her power for something so petty. But surely no one would blame her for closing her eyes for just a moment, and imagining the boy's panicked screams as he sat in that tree or thatch, before he begged for her help in getting him down. The whole village might hate her, taunt her, and whisper rumors that only children dared repeat in her hearing, but when they needed help, they would still come to the cottage, hat in hand, and she would give it. Her grandmother's cottage in the woods, since the night her parents' home had burned, but it was the best place for her now. For in the forest's isolation, she did not have to listen to the taunts every day. "Ah, there you are. Are the boots as pretty as the Baron promised?" Grandmother asked, climbing laboriously to her feet and brushing the dirt from her skirt. She lived in the garden most days, talking more to her plants than she did to Rosa. Rosa's heart sank. "I'm sorry, Grandmother, I forgot the boots. I was talking to Allard, who needs another of your elixirs, and I was so lost in thought when I left the great house." Grandmother's eyes were sharp, seeing into Rosa's very soul. "Is that boy of the Baron's begetting more bastards? Who is it this time?" Rosa sighed. "Peroska, who else? It seems he cannot help himself around her." Grandmother snorted. "Oh, I think he helps himself all too readily, and that's the problem. He should marry the girl and be done with it. Not like anyone better will have him." Did Rosa imagine it, or did Grandmother's eyes dart toward her as she said that? The problem is that Allard still hopes, Grandmother. No matter what I say, he is adamant that the best Baroness should be a skilled healer. Then I shall go into town to fetch my boots myself on the morrow, and have a word with the boy while I'm at it. The best Baroness is one who'll give him babies, and Peroska's as fertile as they come. His father's not getting any younger after all." Grandmother led the way into the house, holding the door open for Rosa. Rosa followed her in and thumped her sack on the table. "I remembered your honey though. Now we should have enough to start a new batch of mead. I'll make a start on it on the morrow, when you go into town." "You're not coming with me?" More than ever, Grandmother's eyes seemed to read Rosa's soul. "You're not in love with that silly boy, are you?" Rosa shook her head. "No. Allard is, perhaps the only friend I have in town, that's all. Everyone else hates me, calling me a witch and saying I murdered my parents." "You are a witch. Their witch." When Grandmother said it, it sounded like an honorable occupation, instead of an insult. "No, that's you, Grandmother. You cure their ills. I just deliver things and collect the payment." Grandmother waved away her doubts. I do nothing that you cannot. And while my magic is waning, yours grows stronger every day. Why, with a wave of your hand, you could clear the whole village of tonight's snowfall. They'd pay attention to you then. They'd still call me a witch, only louder, Rosa grumbled before her grandmother's words sank in. Wait, snow? It has not snowed here since the winter my parents died. That was the coldest winter in living memory, you said, the sort that we won't see again for 100 years. It's only been 6. The weather does not count the years. It merely is. And I fear this winter will be colder than any we have yet known. I think we have waited long enough. The snow is a sign from the gods that it is time I initiated a new priestess. Will you be ready for the midwinter rites? With grandmother's eyes reading her very soul, Rosa could not lie. No. I had thought to ask Allard, but now, I cannot imagine any man in the village I would want to share the ceremony with. Grandmother patted her hand. If the gods want you for their priestess, they will provide. Who knows? Perhaps the folk tales your mother loved so much will come true, and a knight will come riding into town in pursuit of some noble quest. No man could fail to notice you. Yes, notice her and label her a witch, his voice full of venom as he spat the words. Yet yes, grandmother, was all Rosa said. It's settled then. At midwinter, you will pledge yourself fully to the goddess, as her priestess. The snow will come, and we must guard against it as best we can. Grandmother clapped her hands. Which is why I need new boots. You don't feel the cold as I do, but when you are my age, you'll know. Rosa nodded numbly. Snow brought the wolves down from the mountains. Perhaps she would have her chance at vengeance this winter. If she killed the wolf who'd killed her family, then the men of the village might look on her with admiration instead. She only needed one who was willing to worship the goddess, but she had little hope of even one as things stood now. Once she'd slayed the beast though. There was no doubt in her mind that she could kill the wolf. It was merely a matter of how and when. As an untrained girl, she'd sent the wolf running all those years ago. Now, with her magic completely under her command, he'd be no match for her. 8. The village inn tempted Chase more than he liked to admit. He'd spent so many nights sleeping under hedges, as summer gave way to autumn and the infernal rain that never ceased, that the very thought of a night in a real bed, perhaps even a few hours seated before a fire, made his knees weak. He counted his coins. He had enough for a hot meal or two and a bed, as long as it wasn't their best room. Abraham would have laughed at him counting coppers like this. Then again, Abraham would have turned them to gold at a touch. But Abraham was lost to him, and this was his life now. So Chase surrendered what remained of his wealth to the innkeeper, and asked if the man knew of anyone in need of a knight. The innkeeper scratched his head. Don't know anyone who can afford to keep a knight, except for the king himself, and I'm sure he doesn't need any more. Not like we're at war with anyone right now. But if you're fixing to make a name for yourself so the king might hire you, you might try your hand at monster slaying. Monsters don't exist, Chase said. The innkeeper's pitying look took him by surprise. Then you're the only man who hasn't heard of the cursed wolf of the north, or the Casmiris dragon. Chase shook his head. Indeed I haven't. Perhaps you could pour me an ale and tell me the story? I'll do you one better. Go speak to the crier, sent out to search for a dragon slayer. He's seen the dragon himself. The innkeeper pointed at a boy not much younger than Chase, unrolling a scroll on the table. Fighting a beast might be better than killing another man, enemy or no, Chase told himself. He'd seen enough death. He turned his head to better read the boy's poster. Heroes wanted, the poster read, for monster slaying of all kinds. Apply within. Not that he was much of a hero, whatever the herald in Aros had said. Monster slaying might help him earn both his keep and a real reputation. It would at least keep his thoughts from straying to Abraham and Major a dozen times a day. Chase raised his voice. "Are you looking for a hero, boy?" The boy looked up. He looked resigned, Chase thought. As if to emphasize his point, the boy sighed. Chase pulled the poster toward him. He tapped the crudely drawn dragon. "Where's the dragon and what's the reward?" "Casmiris, between the city and the river," the boy said. He didn't show a trace of fear. Interesting. Either the beast wasn't so fearsome or the boy hadn't actually seen it. "But I don't know the reward. Every time it kills another knight, the king increases it." A dragon that could kill many knights was definitely fearsome. "How big is the beast, and does it breathe fire?" Chase persisted. Now the boy showed the first hint of fear, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed nervously. "It would scarcely fit in the square outside, and its fiery breath is so hot, it has been known to melt a man's armor." He shuddered. He'd seen this melting in person. Yet he'd survived. By running or hiding or both, Chase decided. This boy was no dragon slayer. A fire-breathing monster who melted armor and had killed many knights. Such a beast would take a true hero to slay it, the sort of brave, foolhardy man who would undertake a quest for the sheer glory of it. Chase was too sensible a man for such things. Chase lifted his hand and the scroll rolled up. "Which means it's impossible to kill." He resolved to ask the innkeeper about the wolf. That wouldn't be an impossible task. "Not impossible," the boy countered. "All creatures must die sometime." Chase stared at the boy. There was a steel to him that his youth had hidden until now. The boy himself might not slay the dragon, but he was determined to recruit the man who could do the deed. Perhaps he'd known one of the slayed knights, a father or mentor perhaps. He had a personal grudge against this dragon, but wasn't silly enough to fight it alone and die unmourned. Chase grinned. "Even us. But there's nothing heroic about being roasted alive. I'm Sir Chase." He held out his hand. "George," the boy said, clasping Chase's arm briefly before letting go. Chase gestured to the innkeeper. "2 more ales for me and my friend here." When the innkeeper nodded, Chase turned back to George. "Where are you headed?" "Arros," George said. Chase swallowed. From the maw of a fire-breathing dragon to the court of Arros' icy queen? He had to warn him. "Not a good city for heroes, Arros," he managed to say. "Their queen isn't fond of adventurers." He suppressed a shudder as he took a cup of ale from the innkeeper. George raised his eyebrows. "That's not what I heard. When they hold tourneys, the queen richly rewards the victor. She holds heroes in high regard, or so it is said." George drank deeply. Sir Chase choked on his ale. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he said, I heard the same. Until I met the woman. Beautiful as the day is long but cold as ice. Looking into her eyes is enough to freeze your soul, and no mistake." He had a peculiar vision of Queen Margarita facing down a fire-breathing dragon. It would be an even match, Chase thought. Now if it was that princess daughter of hers, the dragon would be doomed. But princesses did not fight dragons. Pity. He'd pay money to see a girl fight. Like Major had wanted to, but their father had forbidden it. He'd like to see anyone try to refuse the Princess of Arros, if she wanted to take up a sword. "Then I'll be sure to avoid her," George said. That wouldn't be hard. The boy wouldn't be invited to a feast where he might meet the princess. Wise choice. Chase raised his ale. "And I will avoid your dragon. I heard about a pack of troublesome wolves in the north. I might go see to those instead." George clunked his cup against Chase's. "To both our good health and long lives," he said gravely and drank. Without the interference of women, Chase added silently as he downed his ale. Women and wolves didn't mix, so he'd be safe in the north. 9. Now, will you be all right brewing all that up by yourself? Grandmother asked, surveying the jars of honey that covered the table. Rosa didn't spare the table a glance. Of course. I'd sooner brew 10 times this much than go into town again after yesterday. Grandmother shook her head. The townspeople will never show you the respect you deserve unless you believe you deserve it. You are their witch, soon to be their priestess, far more important than the Baron and his line, for our family has been here for centuries. You must wear your magic boldly with pride, much like your red cloak. But today save your magic for your brewing, for that is how the best mead is made. Rosa bowed her head. Yes, grandmother. There was no point in arguing. Grandmother had earned the respect of the villagers and the Baron, but Rosa knew she could never ignore the taunts when her own head told her they were right. She might not have murdered her own family, but their blood lay on her hands. If she'd been home, her magic might have saved them, as it had saved herself. But she'd arrived too late. Grandmother's eyes brimmed with sympathy. You dwell too much on the past and what cannot be changed, Rosa. Look up to the future, for that is where hope lies. Not until the wolf was dead, she thought but did not say. Instead, she managed a smile. My future is all about boiling and brewing, until all the barrels are full of mead. Which I hope will taste as good as the last batch. Grandmother returned her smile. Better, I'm sure. You've learned so much since last winter, the village will have no need of me anymore. She swept her cloak around herself and strode out before Rosa could respond. For a moment, Rosa was a lost little girl again, all alone with barely a breath of magic to call upon, before she took a deep breath and reminded herself that girl had grown up. Stronger, more powerful. Powerful enough to seek vengeance when the wolf returned, she hoped. And strong enough to brew an ocean of medicinal mead alone. She stoked the fire, filled the cauldron from the well, and set it on the fire to boil. Then she headed outside and lit the fire pits, which would be blazing hot enough to heat the other cauldrons once she'd filled them. Her day consisted of wood, water, and watching for bubbles, stirring in the honey, setting the mixture aside to cool, before sealing it up in barrels to ferment for a few weeks. Then she could use her magic to lift the barrels up to the loft, where the warmth from the winter fire would help the brew mature. Darkness had fallen by the time she'd stopped stoking the fires, but she couldn't leave the cauldrons out in night's chill and let ice ruin her hard work. She filled the last few barrels and sent them soaring inside with their fellows. Only then did she allow herself to head back into the house to rest. Too exhausted to cook, she swallowed a few bites of bread and cheese. Rosa's arms ached as she brought in wood to feed the fire for the night, but her day's work would go to waste if she let the fire go out. Not to mention grandmother would admonish her for such laziness when she returned in the morning, for surely grandmother had accepted the Baron's hospitality for the night instead of walking home so late in the dark. So Rosa toppled into bed and fell asleep almost instantly, without a worry in the world. 10. Morning held an unfamiliar chill, forcing Rosa to reach for a shawl to wrap around her shoulders as she rekindled the fire from the coals. A cup of willow bark tea would see off the aches from yesterday's labor before today's began. Seeing as she'd left yesterday's milk in the cellar and forgotten about it, after today's milking, she might have enough to make cheese. She left a pot of water over the fire to boil, then headed outside to the barn where the goats slept. Snow had turned their fertile dark soil white. Rosa cursed, then summoned a whirlwind to whisk it away from grandmother's garden. The spells grandmother had cast on the clearing usually kept all but that hardiest frost away. She had an arrangement with the surrounding trees, or so she'd said, but perhaps even trees could not keep a snowstorm out completely. No wonder grandmother had stayed the night with the Baron. Walking through snow was to return to trudging through despair. That winter Rosa had lost her family to the wolf. The coldest winter in living memory, or so everyone had said. She hadn't felt the cold, for she'd been too wrapped up in her grief. But now, snow sent a chill through her heart that had nothing to do with grief. This year her family would have justice. And snow would not touch her or hers again. Rosa bit her lip, strengthening the spell that swirled the snow away from her home so that it would not stop until the storm was over. Better than dwelling on the evidence that grandmother's magic was weakening. A faint sound reached her ears, and Rosa sent a gust of wind to tell her more. The sound grew louder until she could discern the crunch of wheels on the snow-dusted road, accompanied by the low voices of the men who drove the wagon. Milking and cheesemaking would have to wait. Rosa had time to comb her hair and straighten her cloak before the wagon trundled into view, accompanied by 3 guards and Allard. Despite the freezing wind, all 4 of them removed their hats and held them to their chests. Rosa's heart sank. "Allard, what's happened?" she demanded, looking from him to the wagon and back again. Casks stood on either side of a covered lump that ran the length of the wagon. "What's all this?" "Ah, this is my father's gift to you. And your grandmother. As thanks for all that you do for the village. All supplies from our cellar to help you through the winter. You'll need it now that—" "What, Allard?" Rosa couldn't keep the bite of impatience out of her tone. One of Allard's men twitched the cloth aside. Beneath it was grandmother's green cloak, ending in a pair of brand new boots. "No." Rosa doubled over. Not grandmother. The only family she had left. "What happened?" she demanded. "My father asked her to stay last night, but she refused. She insisted on walking home. One of the woodcutters found her this morning, lying in the snow on the road at the edge of the forest. Some cowardly creature had attacked her." Dread curled in Rosa's belly. There was only one creature it could have been. Rosa reached for her grandmother's cloak, exposing the old woman's throat. Or what would have been her throat, if the wolf hadn't ripped it out. "My father wanted to bury her in the churchyard where our family lie, but I knew she wouldn't have wanted that." "That you would want?" Allard couldn't seem to finish. "Yes. She would want to be buried in the woods where she lived," Rosa lied. Allard and all the Baron's family worshipped the new religion, the one with the dying deity, instead of the multiple gods she knew lived in this part of the world. The gods her grandmother had prayed to and sacrificed to every day of her life. Grandmother would be accorded a funeral appropriate for a high priestess who'd served the forest gods, her body would be burned on their altar, and her ashes scattered to strengthen the forest. "My father has sent men out to hunt the creature before it kills anyone else," Allard said. "You need not fear. I will bring you its head myself." Rosa shook her head. "It's the wolf. The same one who killed my family. It came for her. Your hunters will not find it. It's too clever for that. When it comes, it will come for me. And I will be ready for it, this time. I will bring you its head. I'll carry it through the streets, and maybe then people will finally believe that it was a wolf, not me, who killed my family." Allard looked alarmed. "We do believe you. No one thinks such a terrible thing. But now that your grandmother is gone, perhaps you should consider moving to the village. I would be happy to offer you the hospitality of the great house." His eyes shone with eagerness. "And who will placate the gods of the forest, with grandmother gone?" "No, Allard, I will not move to town. I will stay here, where I belong." She eyed the wagon. "The supplies you brought should see me through the winter." "But what then? I know your grandmother was a powerful witch, but you? Oh, so earnest. Even when he insulted her." Rosa bit down hard, tasting blood. "I am my grandmother's successor, and anyone who thinks my power is any less than hers is welcome to test it." She sent a gust of wind across the clearing, lifting grandmother's cape from her body and making it dance as though her spirit animated the cloth, 10 feet up in the air. The cloak reached the space between the firepits, and Rosa felt the faint warm air current stirring from the not-quite-dead coals. She sent the breeze swirling through the coals, 4 gouts of flame that climbed higher than her house. "But not before I have sought justice for my family." She swallowed. "And grandmother." Tears threatened, but she blinked them away. She would not cry in front of these men. "Rosa." She ignored Allard. "You may store the supplies in the cellar. I'm sure if I must take up my grandmother's healing duties on top of my own, I won't have time to do it. But if your families have need of healing throughout the winter, be assured your kindness will be remembered." Allard's men nodded and set about unloading the wagon. Rosa let the air lift grandmother's body, carrying it to where her cloak lay spread out on the ground, between the firepits. She gently laid the body down, like a queen lying in state. For to the forest, grandmother had been the queen of the trees. A power Rosa did not share, though they'd both been able to practice a small amount of healing. Rosa would have to work harder on the herb garden now, without grandmother's magic to make it flourish. The men carried casks, jars and sacks into the house. Rosa took stock of it all, stashing the information into a corner of her mind for later, when she could think about such things. "There's space in the wagon for your things. Please come back to the village, so we can keep you safe. Just for the winter, until the wolf is caught," Allard wheedled. "My place is here," Rosa said, planting her feet. She looked the Baron's son in the eye. "That wolf will die by winter's end, Allard." He nodded once. "Yes, it will." 11. The town looked no different to any of the others Chase had traveled through to get here. The only difference was the depth of the snow, which had fallen steadily until even his mare struggled through the drifts. What passed for a great house here, the seat of the local baron he'd been told, looked like one of the bigger outbuildings on Abraham's estate. A stone barn, not a castle. But he didn't have the time or funds to be choosy. Winter was well and truly here, and his need for shelter at night had forced him to sell his armor piece by piece until nothing remained. If this town wasn't the one beset by wolves, he might have to sell his horse to make it through the winter. No, fate would not be so cruel. She might not want him to live comfortably in the service of the royal court of Aros, but fate could not be such a bitch that she wanted him to die in a ditch halfway to nowhere. But fate was a woman, and a traitorous one at that. He wanted nothing to do with women when his business was with wolves. He headed for the great house, leading his exhausted mare. "You're not from around here." The voice came out of nowhere, until the owner appeared from behind what Chase had thought was a snowdrift. Now he saw it was a half-buried building. A woodshed, judging by the pile of wood in the man's arms. Chase stopped. "No, I'm not. My name is Sir Chase, and I heard your town had a wolf problem. I've come to take care of it." He hoped, he thought, but didn't say. Logs tumbled from the man's arms into the snow. "Master Allard will be pleased to hear it." He headed for the house and opened the door. "Boy, fetch Master Allard. A knight has come to slay the wolf." Chase heard the sound of running feet before the man closed the door again. The man stuck out his hand. "I'm widow. My family have served the barons for generations. But we've never had a wolf this bad. First 6 years ago in that cold winter, and we thought it had gone, but it's back, and more murderous than ever. Last time it murdered a whole family in their house as they slept." Chase's heart sank. That didn't sound like a wolf at all. What had he gotten himself into? But it was too late now. He had no money left. If he did not take this job, he would starve before spring. "Sir Knight, our savior." A well-dressed man of about Chase's own age appeared, his arms held wide as if he intended to embrace him. He did, kissing Chase on both cheeks. "I'm Allard. I thought we wouldn't see anyone else until the spring, though I sent riders out in every direction. Angels must have sent you." An innkeeper on the road between Aros and Casmiris, actually, Chase said. Alad's eyes widened. And you chose to help us instead of slaying the dragon? We are blessed indeed. The admiration in the man's eyes made Chase feel uncomfortable. Hold your praise until the job is done, Baron Alad. Alad shook his head. My father is the Baron. I'm just Alad for as long as my father lives. Which I hope will be a long time. Chase could detect no lie in the man's fierce words. Perhaps Alad truly was a loving son, who had no desire to rule his father's lands. I'm Sir Chase. Alad's eyes shone. Well met, Sir Chase. Tell me what you need to end this plague, and it shall be yours. Plague? I thought your problem was a wolf. A wolf was one thing, but the plague was enough to send him galloping as far and fast as his mare could take him. Winter snows be damned. The wolf that plagues us, yes. God forbid any other misfortunes befall us this winter. Chase breathed out a sigh of relief. I heard there was a bag of gold on offer as reward for anyone who slays the beast. Alad nodded. Yes, that is so. Chase took a deep breath. I must ask for more than that. Board and lodging until spring, which are mine no matter how long it takes me to exterminate your wolf. Whether it takes me a week or the rest of the winter. I have traveled far and... Of course. You shall have a bed in my father's house, and a seat at his table for as long as you like. Rid us of this wolf, and my father may never want you to leave. Alad clapped his hands. You there, take Sir Chase's horse and see it is well cared for. Have his things brought to the house. A man took the reins from Chase and led the mare to the stables. Now join me for dinner. We'll broach a barrel of my father's best wine, and you can tell us tales of other monsters you have slain. Alad said, gesturing for Chase to follow him. No matter what the man had done, Abraham was no monster, and Chase had not slain him. Better that you tell me more about this wolf. Now I am here, I am eager to start. Perhaps even on the morrow. Alad nodded agreeably. Of course, of course. You are a true hero, Sir Chase, to be so intent on your quest. I shall tell you everything I know. And as the words spilled out of the Baron's son, Chase began to have an inkling of a plan. Wolves were crafty beasts, and one who sneaked into a house to kill people as they slept was craftier still. Waiting for it to appear and maybe kill again would never do. But if he could lure it into a trap, where he lay in wait with his bow, he might be able to accomplish this after all. 12. Rosa could delay no longer. The ashes from her grandmother's pyre were cold on the stone altar in the forest, and she had made more cheese than she could eat in a year. The mead would not finish fermenting for some days yet, and Alad's hunters had followed the wolf's trail to a clearing in the forest, before they'd lost it. Treating the hunters' coughs and chills from sleeping in the snow had given her all the information she needed to head out on her own hunt, along with the certainty that no one else would be out in the forest, risking his neck against the beast. The Baron's hunters didn't dare cross the witch who was now the town's only healer, who'd ordered them to rest inside for a week. She'd sacrificed 4 elderly hens to use as bait, or she intended to. The old broilers were still alive, stuffed in the sack over her shoulder. Fresh blood mattered to predators, and surely this wolf was no different. She found the clearing easily enough, though there were no wolf prints to be seen with the fresh dusting of snow the ground had received since the hunters had last been here. But it mattered not. She had no intention of tracking the beast to its lair. Instead, she intended to lure it out with the smell of fresh meat. Rosa moved to the middle of the clearing to slaughter the chickens. Her experienced hands made quick work of the killing part, but she took her time gutting the carcasses, throwing entrails across the snow to spread the blood further. When she was satisfied that she'd made enough of a mess, she washed her hands and sought a suitable vantage point from which she could see clearly, while she waited for dusk. The tallest tree was not the stoutest, but she was light enough to make the climb if she kept close to the trunk. She climbed as high as she dared, before unwrapping the coil of rope she'd worn around her waist to tie herself securely to the trunk. Only then did she string her bow, knowing speed would be her ally once the wolf appeared. The more arrows she could sink into its hide, the better chance she had of killing it before morning. Then perhaps the souls of her family would let her sleep without nightmares. Wrapping her cloak tightly around her to keep out the cold, Rosa settled down to wait. She must have fallen into a light doze, for she opened her eyes to darkness, or near enough. The full moon above lit the clearing, turning the reddened snow into the black of corruption. And yet, something moved across it, like a cloud but more corporeal. She plucked an arrow from her quiver and nocked it, ready to fire. The creature moved closer to the chickens, and Rosa loosed. The arrow found its mark, but the creature that collapsed on the snow was too small to be the wolf. Its tail twitched once, then was still. A silvery fox, she thought, drawn by the bait. Not the wolf at all. She slumped against the tree. Well, the fox would now be bait too. She considered going down to retrieve her arrow and perhaps butcher the fox, to spread more fresh blood over the scene, but decided not to bother. She had plenty of arrows and all night to wait. Silence descended on the clearing again. Rosa longed for a hot meal or even a flask of mead, but she hadn't thought to bring more than a chunk of ham, as she was already heartily sick of cheese. Mead would have ruined her aim anyhow, she told herself as she munched on the cold ham. Something slammed into the trunk of her tree, nearly shaking her out of it, and the ham fell from her fingers to the ground below. A second passed, and she heard the sound of chewing, accompanied by a faint whine, like a dog in pain. Whatever it was crashed into the tree a second time. Then a third. Rosa hung on for dear life, hoping the rope around the trunk would hold. Then she heard the sound of scrabbling, like the creature was digging a hole in the snow. Or a grave. Rosa shook herself. Animals did not dig graves. The sound stopped, but she barely had a moment to breathe a sigh of relief before something hit the tree, harder than before. Again. And again. On the fourth blow, the tree tipped sideways at an alarming angle, spilling Rosa off her branch into space. Only the rope around her kept her from falling. The tree shuddered from the force of another blow, and the rope became uncomfortably tight. She flung her arms out to catch anything that might support her weight, but she dangled too far away to touch anything. Cursing, Rosa pulled out her knife and began sawing at the rope, as another blow sent the tree toppling against the one beside it. A smaller tree that began to buckle under the weight. Rosa sawed faster, barely noticing as she scraped her fingers raw on the rope, for her attention was directed down in the hope that the snowdrift below would be deep enough to break her fall. But all she could see was a pair of glowing blue eyes, staring straight at her. The wolf, she knew without a doubt. The beast flung itself at the tree trunk again. Ominous cracks sounded, though whether from her tree or the other, Rosa couldn't be sure. She could feel the rope stretching, unraveling, ready to drop her within reach of the waiting wolf, but her blood-slicked fingers hummed with power. The rope snapped, but the air caught her as she had commanded it to. She spread her cloak, letting the wind carry her to the lower branches of the next tree. A much sturdier tree than her first choice, though she could no longer see much of the clearing. The wolf's eyes followed her as if the creature could see her. No, surely not. Wolves saw movement and used scent to find their prey. If she stayed still against the trunk, it would lose interest in her and investigate the chickens instead. The wolf that had let the fox go first, like some sort of scout, before attacking the very tree she sat in. Where the arrow had come from. No. Wolves were not that clever. Men thought like that, one skilled in battle. Not animals. Something closed on her boot. Rosa kicked out, and was rewarded with a whine as the wolf let go. She scrambled higher up the tree out of reach. Why wouldn't it leave her alone? Surely now it would go and eat. But the wolf sat down in a patch of moonlight, turning those glowing eyes up at her as if to say it could wait all night. It could, she realized. It could wait all night and all day, its fur protecting it from the cold. Where she had no food, not enough rope to secure herself, and she'd have to sleep sometime. When she did, she'd fall and the wolf would have her. No. If she had to climb 100 trees and ride the air currents until dawn, the wolf would not touch her. If the creature really was a wolf, which she was beginning to doubt. She began to climb. 13. It hadn't been 100 trees, but she had lost count after the first dozen. She'd climbed until she could not reach any higher, then summoned a gust of wind to carry her across the treetops to another tree, which she would climb to the highest point before doing the same again. She fell more than she flew, letting the spread cloak slow her descent, but as the night went on, her mind considered how she might improve upon her situation. Something larger and more rigid than her cloak to catch the air, big enough to lie upon full length as it buoyed her up. But not too heavy, for the air could only lift so much. Rosa reached for the next tree, willing herself to climb it with her aching arms, even if the wolf was no longer in sight. Until the sun rose, she knew the hunter would not sleep. How did she know that? Rosa turned it over in her mind until she found the answer. Magic. Whatever had turned that creature into what it was now, it was magical. A cursed king, an enchanted wolf, what difference did it make? It was no woodland creature to fall into an ordinary trap like the fox had. No, the creature had a man's cunning. A man who wanted to kill her. Who had already killed her family. A creature that would be the next to die. Not her. But she would need a new plan, now she knew what she was hunting. Dawn took her by surprise, as she reached the top of a tree that wasn't far from her cottage. She could see the stone altar below, still dusted in ash. "Grandmother, I will avenge you," she swore as she summoned a final gust to take her safely to the forest floor. Her legs felt as soft as ricotta when she landed, but Rosa didn't dare stay here. She could not rest until the stout walls of the cottage kept the wolf out. With a brief thanks to the gods of the wood for the gift of her magic and for delivering her home safely, she trudged toward the cottage. Only to find that despite all her efforts, someone had beaten her home anyway. 14. Deep in his cups, Allard had grasped Chase's arm with both hands. "Promise me something, Sir Chase," he'd slurred. Chase had nodded once, encouraging the man to continue. "Warn the witch. She lives in a cottage in the woods. Tell her you're here at my request to slay the wolf. Tell her to stay out of the woods, where she'll be safe." Chase had nodded again, agreeing to the man's request. What else could he say anyway? "Thank you," Allard had breathed, before pitching face first onto the table and starting to snore. Chase had reclaimed his arm and headed off to his own bed, where he'd slept like the dead. Now dawn found him outside in the cold, packing enough food into his saddlebags for a week-long hunt, while one of the stable boys fetched him several extra quivers of arrows from the armory. It had been a long time since he'd last hunted with Abraham, and he missed the man more than ever. A few jokes would make his grim task so much easier, but it was not to be. Allard and the Baron were still in their beds, as Chase would be too, if he'd been in the Rumpelstiltskin castle with Major and Abraham. Or even if he'd stayed at the court in Arros. Chase shook himself. He could no longer live in the past. He had a wolf to kill and a new life to make. A life of his own, without Major or Abraham or the help of some far-off court. But first he had to find a witch, a woman who worked magic, like the curse that had turned Abraham from a sane man into a mad one. He set off into the woods, glad to find the snow lay light on the ground under the trees, unlike in town. The path was well worn too, as if many villagers traveled to see the witch. He wondered what the village priest would say about such things. Chase could not recall seeing a church in town, come to think of it. His father would certainly turn over in his grave if he knew. But here, so far from civilization, it was easy to see that the old ways would not die easily. Especially without a church to remind the people that they were supposed to believe in a new faith now. While living in a world with numerous gods and monsters, curses and magic, Chase shivered as the town vanished from sight between the trees. His horse felt no such chill as she plodded onward. He must be imagining the dread that coursed through him, he decided. He struck up a bawdy tune and sang at the top of his lungs to pass the time. He'd managed to sing it through 3 times, or at least the verses he remembered, before the cottage came into view. Stone walls topped with thick thatch which bore only a light dusting of snow. A small enclosure beside it held 2 goats, several chickens and a stable of sorts, with a carefully laid-out garden in the space between. Even in the dead of winter, the garden showed signs of life, for the snow had not completely covered it yet. Magic, the sneaky voice in the back of his mind told him, but he hushed it. It was nothing of the sort. The surrounding trees evidently kept this place clear of snow, much like they'd protected the road to reach here. And there was the witch crossing the clearing to reach her door, her white hair coming loose from her braid. Chase's heart relaxed. An old wise woman, no wonder Allard wanted her warned and protected. Her knowledge of healing herbs was surely important to his people. Chase stepped out of the shadows, straightening his shoulders to make himself look more heroic than he felt. "Fear not, mistress. Your baron has sent me to slay the wolf. If you but keep to your cottage, I will soon make the forest safe for a gentlewoman such as yourself." The witch whirled, sending her cloak flying out around her in a swirl of blood, for it was as red as the stuff in his veins. "Then the baron is a fool, for who will make the forest safe for the likes of you?" Chase's mouth dropped open and he could not seem to close it. What he'd taken for an old woman was nothing of the sort. Her youthful face and equally youthful figure, for her thick woolen dress only emphasized the curve of the flesh beneath it, were nothing to the blue fire in her eyes that held him transfixed. Then she smiled just a little and Chase's heart turned to mush. "Go. Find something else to slay. A dragon or some such thing. There is magic at work here that you cannot begin to understand." She flicked her fingers in dismissal. That flick broke the spell somehow and Chase's tongue unfroze. "I cannot simply leave," he said stiffly. "I have accepted a quest, and it would be dishonorable to run away before it is complete. I am a knight, and my honor is more precious than my own life. I would not expect a woman to understand matters of honor." Her smile widened to a grin. "Then you're a bigger fool than the Baron, Sir Knight. Honor is about doing what's right, and the right thing for you to do is leave this forest. Now. While you still have your life." She opened the door of her cottage, stepped inside, then slammed it shut. Chase opened his mouth to defend himself, but that would be pointless, she wouldn't hear a word of it. And what could he say to convince her she was wrong? Nothing. Deeds spoke louder than words. So he would let his deeds speak for him. He would kill this wolf, drop its head on her doorstep, and then she'd see who was a fool. He nudged his horse to continue along the path, in the direction the witch had come from. That wolf would die before the day was done, he swore. 15. More than anything, Rosa wanted to sleep, but sleep refused to come. Her grandmother's words haunted her. She had predicted the arrival of a knight, right in time for midwinter. A pity she hadn't predicted the wolf, too. If that poor fool of a knight did not take her advice and instead went hunting for the wolf, it was his body she'd find next. She told herself she didn't care what happened to a stranger. Men could do whatever foolish things they pleased in the forest, and if it got them killed. But it was her job to protect those who wandered into the forest. She served the gods of the forest as her grandmother and all the witches before her had, and this was her domain. Especially when there was magic involved. For no one else in the village or any of the towns around was a witch. And to serve the gods of the forest properly, to become their priestess instead of just a novice, she needed that knight alive. Cursing, she rose from her bed and opened the door to see if the knight still waited outside. To her surprise, he seemed to have taken her advice and headed back to town, for there was no sign of him or his horse. Good. She longed to go back inside, but her conscience would not allow it. For if the Baron had sent one fool into the woods, he would send more. And she might not be able to warn them all. With one last longing look at her bed, she fastened her cloak and set out for the village. The boys who had taunted her before her grandmother's death were engaged in a snowball fight in the snowdrift beside the road, too busy to pay attention to her. Or so Rosa thought, until a snowball came sailing her way. Did the little brats know she'd spent all night in the forest, protecting them? Risking her life for theirs? They would never have dared to throw such a thing at her grandmother. Magic came to her as easily as breathing now. A puff of air turned the snowball into a flurry that swirled harmlessly to the road at her feet. She turned to face the boys. "Next time that's what will happen to you," she said. The boys' eyes widened in horror before they bolted. She shook her head at the gullibility of small boys. As if she could summon a wind strong enough to do such a thing. The worst she could do to them was lift them onto their parents' roof or into a nearby tree, and they'd probably just climb down in any case. Rosa felt eyes upon her as she approached the great house. Before her grandmother's death, she would have tried to ignore the prickle between her shoulder blades and the person causing it, but today she was done with evasions. She would turn and face the wolf if that's what it was, and anyone else presented so little threat compared to the dread beast that she feared no one. "Is there a leaf clinging to my cloak that you stare so?" she snapped. "You do not deserve something so fine. Not when you scarcely give him the time of day." "It should have been mine," a female voice hissed. Paroska sat outside the smithy where her father worked, her eyes burning hotter than the forge. The silly girl thought Allard had given her this cloak? Ah, the girl's jealousy had made her foolish indeed. Especially when Rosa was certain the cloak had been a gift from the Baron to grandmother, like many of the valuable items in the cottage. Except for the beautiful woven carpet hidden in the loft. Grandmother had blushed like a maiden when she described the Crusader knight who'd given her that particular item. Rosa had always thought there was more to that story than her grandmother had said, and now it was too late to ask. She would never know. "Have you ever asked him for a new cloak? After all you give him, seeing as he won't even let you keep his child, surely he owes you something," Rosa said. 2 spots of red appeared on Paroska's cheeks as her hand flew to her belly. "I'm sure I have no idea what you mean." As if Rosa had read the girl's thoughts, she knew Paroska hadn't taken the latest elixir yet, or Allard had not yet given it to her. She still carried Allard's baby. Rosa smiled. In a village as small as this, nothing remains a secret long from the village witch. Least of all about the girl who might one day become the next Baroness. "I'd be a better one than you." Paroska spat. The girl was right, but Rosa did not need to tell her that. The next Baroness would need to be a broodmare, or the Baron's bloodline would die out, and the king would give these lands to someone else. Someone who might not respect the gods of the forest as much as the Baron and his ancestors. Yet another thing to confront Allard about, wolves and now his choice of wife. If grandmother were here, but she wasn't, so this task fell to her now too. Being the next Baroness, to be endlessly bedded by Allard in between popping out babies, would be such an easy life compared to being the village witch. But Rosa would still be expected to waddle around the village in between births. Better that Paroska bear the babies. Or any girl, really. Allard might one day be the Baron, but he was a bore in bed. Or was that a bore? Not the sort of passion suitable for a priestess, anyway. Rosa walked on into the main hall of the great house. "Allard," she shouted. Ah! A man lifted his head from the table on the dais. Had Allard been sleeping on it? Rosa strode forward. Allard! She had never seen him look quite this disheveled. Why, he looked like he needed to shave after sleeping there all night. And here she thought he simply hadn't been old enough to grow a beard yet. He beamed. You came. I shall have the servants prepare a chamber for you at once. My mother's has not been used since. Rosa silenced him with a look. I came to ask you why there was a knight on my doorstep this morning. A knight who believed he was on a quest to slay my wolf, Allard. Do you have any idea how dangerous that creature is? Allard yawned. Of course. It's a wolf that killed your family. Very dangerous indeed. Which I'm sure is why you are here. Accepting my invitation. I shall send someone to the next town for the priest at once, for the sooner we are married. We're not getting married. He stared at her. Why, of course we are. Don't you remember that midsummer when we sneaked away from the feast and lay together? We promised we would never part. I admit I should have taken you as my wife then, but father was fine then. Now there must be no delay. Rosa screwed up her face. Midsummer, 6 years ago? The first summer after I lost my family, and went to live with my grandmother. I was 16, Allard, and we'd both drunk too much mead. I'm surprised you remember anything of that night. She'd plied him with that much mead in the hope that he hadn't. She had not been so drunk when she'd accepted the comfort his body offered. Those who had taken up the new religion believed such relations between a man and a woman to be a sin, but Rosa knew the gods of the forest thought otherwise. They expected their priestesses to encourage as much spilling of seed as possible, especially at their most sacred festivals. Particularly when a priestess in training began her novitiate, as she had that night. Allard's kisses and caresses that night had been reverent to the point of goddess worship, which is why she had chosen him to share her mead in the moonlight, before he helped her shed her virgin's blood before the altar. One night of pleasure, consecrating her body to the fertility of the forest, before taking the bitter elixir at dawn to ensure no baby was born of the union. I dream of it every night, praying for you to share my bed again. There is no one else, Rosa. No one but you. He sounded so earnest, as if he truly believed his own words. What about Peroska? She demanded. Peroska? His face went blank. You mean the blacksmith's daughter? The same girl you asked me to mix an elixir for? Rosa prompted. Allard flushed. That was nothing. I was merely doing the girl a favor. She had evidently done something untoward with some peasant boy or other and was too frightened to ask you herself, so she confided in me, begging for my help. Allard, half the town can hear you scream each other's names when you're rolling around in the hayloft together. Her father might be the only man who doesn't know, if only because of the noise in the smithy. She blew out a breath. But I didn't come to talk about you and your exploits. I came to talk about the knight and the wolf. Allard rose and seized her hands. But we must. You must, Rosa. For my father, he is not well, and I fear he has not long left. The Baron is ill? She'd never known the man to have so much as a head cold. Grandmother had prided herself on the Baron's good health, and received many gifts from the man in thanks for it. After the shock of your grandmother's death, he took to his bed, and has hardly been out of it since, except last night, where he insisted on greeting the knight. I fear he already regrets it. Allard led the way upstairs, to the private chambers. Rosa half expected Allard to show her his mother's rooms first, but his worry for his father had driven any amorous or matrimonial matters out of his head. Mistress Rosa is here, father, Allard said softly, gesturing for Rosa to precede him. Mistress Rosa? She'd never been called that before. Perhaps she had slept after all and this was a dream. Except, in no dream, nightmare or otherwise, had she ever thought to see the Baron looking less alive than her grandmother's corpse. His skin had taken a grey cast, and no one was more surprised than Rosa when his eyes blinked open. He was not yet dead. "Leave us, boy. See that you send the girl home with a gift befitting Mistress Saskia." Allard frowned. "But father, Mistress Saskia is always asking for more honey to make mead. See that she has all that we have left." The Baron fixed his eyes on his son. Allard bowed his head. "Yes, father." He departed. Baron Arnold turned his eyes on Rosa. "Do you have Saskia's gift for healing?" She'd thought she had, but if her grandmother's healing magic had kept death at bay for who knew how long, Rosa didn't think she could match that kind of power. Yet she was the only witch he had, so she lifted her chin and said, "She said my magic was more powerful than hers, but I must assess your condition before I can say if I can help you." She laid her hand on his forehead, bit her lip and closed her eyes, letting her magic sweep through his body. It reminded her of a weed-choked field, with some sort of strange growth pushing out the normal parts inside his body. In order to heal an affliction like this, she would need grandmother's knowledge of plants and growth, and her affinity with such things. Rosa could cure a cold or heal an infected wound if she simply swept the foreign matter out of the blood the way she sent a gust of wind to do her bidding, but this stuff grew everywhere. Was a part of him. Rosa released the Baron. She wanted to look anywhere but into his eyes, and yet she could look nowhere else. "What did my grandmother tell you about your condition?" she asked finally. "That it is like a forest growing around a castle. The walls will only remain strong for so long, but the forest will always win in the end," he said. Rosa nodded. "My grandmother kept the forest at bay. But now—" She didn't want to continue, for if the Baron didn't know about her grandmother's death. "Now Saskia is gone, there is no one strong enough to fight it," the Baron finished for her. "Don't try to lie to a dying man, Mistress Rosa. As Saskia often told me, it is a witch's duty to tell the truth, however unpalatable it may be, for it will out in the end. Are you indeed a witch?" Rosa nodded. "Of course, but my power is over air, not plants." "Did your grandmother teach you the old ways? The ways of the forest?" She nodded again. "She did." "Then will you protect the village from the forest? You will take her place as priestess when my son takes my place?" She straightened her shoulders. "I took up my duties upon my grandmother's death, though I was helping her long before then. I do my duty not for you or for the village but for—" "Hush. Saskia chose her successor well, I am sure. I never expected to outlive her, but she would not let me die either. Even though the weeds within me grow stronger every day, she kept pushing them back. Refused to stay the night here, insisting she had to get back, to prepare you to be her replacement. If I regret anything, 'tis letting that good woman go. But I could not have held her against her will. Not Saskia." "You are not responsible for the wolf," Rosa said. She was. And she would not shirk her responsibilities. Not in this. "No, but I could have ordered the hunt earlier when she urged me to, after your family was killed. Yet I did not, for we could ill spare the men. And there were no other attacks, so there was no need. Until now." "I will not let the beast take another victim," Rosa said. "Let the men kill it. My son boasts of a brave knight who will head them. A hero of many battles. Let the men do the work, for what else are we men for? But you see that her spirit is appeased. When they bring that beast's body to lay it at your feet, see that it burns. For Saskia." It might be a witch's duty to tell the truth, but Rosa could leave parts out. "When it is dead, I will see that the body burns," she said. The Baron smiled faintly. "You are just like her. A witch and a warrior. Make sure my son sees you safely home to your cottage with whatever he found in the cellar." The Baron lay back against his pillows and closed his eyes. He began to snore. Rosa took one last look at the man, for he would not live much longer and she might not see him again, before she headed back downstairs. Allard was waiting for her in the yard, supervising as a wagon was filled with things for her. "I'm sorry, Allard," she said before he could ask. "At most, I can give you some medicine that will ease his pain. But there is little more I can do for him now." He nodded. "Tell my men what you need and they will bring it back for you. You must stay here to tend to him. To help him live as long as he can. I shall have rooms prepared." "No." It came out louder than Rosa expected, startling her, but everyone in the yard stopped to stare. "Allard, I will not stay here as your wife or your kept healer. I am going home, right after I give your cook instructions so that she may prepare what is necessary to make your father comfortable in his remaining days. Nothing I can do will save your father, but if I do not hunt down that wolf, he may kill again. And I will not have that blood on my hands. Why do you persist in this ridiculous notion that you and only you can kill this beast? It is not a task for a girl. We have a knight, a true hero, who will do the deed. Let him be your champion. My father needs you. I need you." She refused to be swayed by his wheedling tone. "Either your knight will not find the beast or he will be killed. He won't last the week, Allard." His eyes lit up. "Then that is what I ask. A week. Stay here safe for a week. If the knight returns with the dead beast as I expect, then you can go home, knowing you will be safe." It would take her a week to work out how to outsmart the beast, but she would not spend it here. Not to mention midwinter was less than a week away. "What will you give me in exchange for doing as you ask?" Allard spread his arms wide, taking in the rapidly filling wagon and the men carrying more casks up from the cellars. "Anything you wish." Rosa wet her lips. "Send for that priest. When he arrives, you will wed." "Thank God." Rosa continued, "You will wed Peroska and do your utmost to beget an heir. For your father will rest more peacefully if he knows his bloodline will continue after you." "Peroska? But—" She gazed steadily back into his hurt eyes. "Forget midsummer and any childish passion you may have held for me. In a few days you will become barren, and the sooner you have an heir, the better. For that you need a fertile wife. Fate has given you Peroska, and you would be a fool not to accept such a gift." His voice came out hoarse. "If I agree to marry the girl, will you promise to stay safe?" "A week then, I agree to. A week where you may find me at home. For all the wolf attacks have been here in the village, but the beast would not dare come to the cottage. Truth, for there was ancient magic in the stones beneath it. Magic Allard did not need to know about." Allard blew out a breath. He didn't look happy, but he said, "Very well. I shall send for the priest. But if you change your mind—" "I won't." She wet her lips. "But warn your heroic knight that I think the beast has magic of some sort. The creature is not what it appears to be." Sir Chase needs no warnings. He set out early this morning with everything he needs. He swore to kill the beast, and I believe him. Have faith, Rosa. The knight had not come back? That meant the poor fool was alone in the forest, beset by a beast he couldn't kill. And she'd just given her word she wouldn't hunt the wolf for another week. Cursing, she set off for home. 16. As Chase headed steadily uphill, the trees thinned until he came upon another clearing, but this one was covered in snow. Well, mostly snow. In the middle of it was the remains of what looked like a recent kill, ringed round with feathers and bloody wolf prints. He surveyed the trees around the edge of the clearing and nodded in satisfaction. This was the place to set up his trap. All he needed was bait. Movement at the top of the slope caught his eye, a rabbit, tugging at a scrap of grass that grew sideways out of the vertical cliff face. Chase strung his bow, then fitted an arrow to the bowstring. Without his golden armor, he wouldn't miss this time. He exhaled, then released, knowing the arrow would hit its mark. The rabbit didn't make a sound as it toppled over, dead. Chase tied his mare to a trunk just inside the tree line, before scrambling up the slope to collect his kill. The best place to set the trap was right here, he decided, pulling out a knife. He gutted the dead rabbit, flinging its entrails across the snow before dropping the carcass among the mess. If that didn't attract the wolf, he didn't know what would. Now all he had to do was climb a tree and wait for the wolf to show up. He'd shoot it, bring it back to the witch, then drag the carcass into town to collect his reward. Easy. Chase settled into a suitable perch, wrapped his cloak around him, set his bow across his lap in readiness, and waited. 17. By the time she'd reached home, Rosa still had no more idea of how better to slay the wolf than she had that morning, but she had thought up a plan of how to find the knight without breaking her word to Allard. But in order for her plan to work, she needed to learn to fly before dusk, when the wolf would come out to hunt. Rosa already knew her cloak wasn't good enough to achieve true flight. She needed something like a boat or a raft that could float on air. If her father, a carpenter, was still alive, he'd build something in moments, but she was not as practiced as he'd been with wood or tools. There had been an old door in the lumber pile, though. She dug it out and laid it on the ground. All she had to do was fly it around the clearing. Rosa took a deep breath and bit her lip. The door rose off the ground, but the higher she lifted it, the more magic it took, and she'd barely moved it yet. Sweat broke out on her forehead as she gave the hovering door a push. It toppled end over end before it righted itself, flying on a slight angle before it tipped again, hanging sideways for a moment, before it plummeted. Finally, she let it fall to earth. She could never travel atop the door if she couldn't hold it steady. Something lighter, perhaps. A blanket flapped around the clearing with little effort, but when she tried to keep it steady, she found it impossible. The blanket rolled and folded with the slightest change of direction. A woven screen her grandmother had sometimes placed before the fire to hide its light at night fared better, but air whistled through the gaps, so it lost height quickly, though it held steady. The blanket pegged to the screen made its wobbly way around the clearing without falling, but the combination was almost as heavy as the door. Rosa could not fly across the forest on such a heavy raft. Ready to give up, she carried the items back inside. It was getting late. She should start dinner soon. The knight would have to wait until the morrow and survive on his wits for the night, such as they were. Rosa decided to bring a smoked sausage down from the loft and make a stew with it, and some vegetables from the cellar. With the loft so full of fermenting mead barrels, she had to climb on top of them to reach the sausage. From her perch, she spotted her grandmother's prized crusader carpet. Thickly woven with stiff backing, it might hold up for a flight. She forgot the sausage and dragged the carpet outside, then spread it on the ground. If this didn't work, then she truly would give up for the day. But if it did, she would go and get the knight before dinner. The surface undulated a little as it rose, but the carpet held steady, much like the screen. Rosa sent it around the clearing, lifting it higher as it went. The carpet did not weigh nearly as much as the screen or the door, and while it rippled a little, it did not roll up altogether as the blanket had. She made it fly around the clearing a second time, level with the treetops. As smooth as a bird in flight, once it had the air beneath it, it glided almost effortlessly. Rosa laughed. What would her grandmother have said, watching her precious carpet flying about? She would have said it was a waste of magic. What the carpet needed was a load to carry, or a passenger. Her grandmother might have given the carpet a sack of vegetables to carry, but lack of sleep and her need to save the night made her reckless. If she fell, she could slow her descent, she reasoned, as she swooped the carpet close enough for her to leap on. She flung herself headlong at the carpet, clutching the edges in her desperation to stay on, as she remembered to keep the air flowing beneath it, buoying her up. She made the carpet do a slow lap around the clearing, close enough to the ground that a fall would not hurt her. Then she lifted it higher, letting it move faster. She did not understand it, but that seemed to take less magic. Higher, then faster. The air obeyed her thought before she'd fully considered it, flying her almost to the treetops like a circling eagle. Rosa's breath caught in her throat, her hair blowing back in the wind that seemed to claw at her eyes, but still she held on. By all that was holy, she was flying. She let out a whoop of triumph and pushed the carpet higher, so it cleared the treetops altogether. The mountains rose up in the distance, snowy crags that gave way to naked stone, then forest as far as the eye could see, until she turned west, where the village lay. The setting sun turned the snowy fields to fire, and Rosa could not take her eyes off the glorious scene. If she but had the skill to paint such a sight, she would be able to look upon it always. But sunset meant more than just golden light. Sunset would give way to dusk, and she had a night to find. If the man still lived by the time she found him, for searching the forest at night was an impossible task for anyone, even a witch who could fly. And if she didn't find him alive at midwinter, she would need to find another man. Muttering a curse against all brave, foolish men, she headed out. 18. A scream sliced through the air, startling Chase out of his doze. Whatever it was, it hadn't sounded human. The sound came again, accompanied by the drum of hooves that sounded exactly like a horse breaking into a gallop. Or trying to. His horse. Chase twisted, trying to see his mare. Moonlight lit up the clearing almost as bright as day, but it did not penetrate the canopy behind him. Short yips and barks came out of the bushes, the sound of excited dogs. Then a third scream that ended in a gurgle. The sickening crunch of bone. The wolf had killed his horse. The last thing he'd had left of value. Fury rose up at fate, the wolf, and everything in between. Chase would not let them take everything from him. Not while he still had a strong right arm. He began to climb down the tree. He slipped a few times, including the last few yards down the trunk, but he did not care. He would kill the wolf and buy a new horse with the reward. Chase reached for his sword, then thought better of it. The sound of the blade sliding out of the scabbard would alert the beast to his presence. Better to use a well-placed arrow once he could see the creature. He took a deep breath, put an arrow to the bowstring, then peeked around the trunk he'd tied his horse to. A pair of glowing eyes regarded him. Then another. And another. Dozens of eyes glowed in the dark, all pointed at him. Excited dogs, his half-asleep brain had told him. Not dogs. Wolves. A whole pack of them. All staring at him over the carcass of his horse. He bolted. Chase clawed his way up a tree, then slid painfully down it, hearing a crunch as he landed. Then pain exploded in his leg, blinding him. In the dark he couldn't see the source. Had a wolf closed its jaws on his leg, bringing him down for the pack? No. He wouldn't die here, a dog's dinner. He reached for the branches above him, hauling himself up by his arms alone, even as his muscles screamed in pain. But he could not stop, he'd seen dogs jump this high and wolves were no different. He needed to climb higher, so they couldn't reach him. Up and up and up, until he emerged into moonlight again, at the top of the tree. He sighed and sat down heavily. Surely this would be enough. The branch beneath him bent, then snapped, spilling him out into space. Out of the tree and into the waiting jaws of the monsters below. 19. Rosa headed for the clearing where she'd laid her trap, figuring it was as good a place to start as any. If the knight had heard from the Baron's men that they'd tracked the wolf that far, then he might have had the same idea as she had. A scream told her she was heading in the right direction. The wolf had caught something tonight, though that hadn't sounded human. It was not yet full dark, but the shadows beneath the tree canopy hid much. She flew lower to get a closer look. Her blood froze in her veins at the sight of not one wolf but at least a dozen, tearing at their prey, which appeared to be a large buck. No, a horse, she realized with deepening horror. The knight's horse. The man could not be far away. As if reading her thought, a tree shuddered violently to her right. Almost as if some large creature had slammed into its trunk, trying to uproot it like the wolf had her perch yesterday. Something cracked. A moment of silence, before the tree shuddered again. Now she could see something scrambling madly up the tree. A tree with whip-thin branches that even she would not have climbed, for it would not hold her weight. The knight fell. Rosa didn't pause to think whether she'd be able to reach him in time. She had to try. Offering up a prayer to the gods of the forest that she would survive this stunt, she swooped beneath the branches. 20. Chase was pretty sure death wasn't supposed to hurt this much. He'd remembered stories of paradise and angels, not pain. Unless he'd somehow found his way to hell. But that couldn't be right. What mortal sin had he committed to end up in eternal torment? Falling out of a tree didn't count. Perhaps accidentally shooting that queen had earned him such a punishment. He was warm too, which had to mean hell. Chase sighed. Abraham would laugh himself sick. Though he was likely here somewhere too, for killing kings was just as treasonous as shooting queens. Probably more so. He forced his eyes open and stared up at wooden boards, not stone. Well, the priests back home had never been able to describe hell. Maybe it was all wood, the better to burn sinners with. But the only fire here burned merrily in a stone fireplace, which had a pot hanging on a hook above the flames. Somehow he'd expected more screaming in hell. Not the happy crackle of a cooking fire. Then the door swung open and a red-cloaked figure strode in. The devil himself, surely. Chase shrank back against the bed beneath him. "Mercy," he whispered. "I did not mean to hurt her. I swear it. Ask the princess. She knows." Then the figure turned to hang up the cloak on a hook by the door. It wasn't the devil at all but the white-haired witch. "You." She set her hand on her hip, for the other carried a basket. "And who were you expecting, Sir Knight? Some princess perhaps?" He shook his head. "No, she saved me once, though I did not deserve it. She won't do it again." His mind finally caught up with his mouth. "Did you save me from the wolves?" She set her basket down on the table. "Of course." "Why?" She stared at him for a moment before saying slowly, "Because it was the honorable thing to do. Saving an innocent from the dark side of a forest he does not understand." "I'm no innocent," Chase protested. "No?" She scrutinized him. "So you'd prefer for me to take you back out there, into the forest? Maybe stake you out in the snow for the wolves to make mincemeat of you as they did your horse? If you don't freeze to death first, of course." Only now did Chase realize he was naked beneath the blankets. She'd removed his clothes? What kind of woman? "My, what big eyes you have, Sir Knight," she teased. "Be easy. I have no intention of healing a man, only to send him to his death. You are safe here." "What did you do with my clothes, wench?" he demanded. She folded her arms across her chest. "It's Mistress Rosa to you, you ungrateful lout. And 'twas not I who shredded your clothes but you yourself, running and climbing and falling through the forest. Why, when I found you, you were wearing little more than rags. You would have died if I hadn't found you. Saved by a woman. Again." Chase felt his cheeks grow hot. "Thank you for saving me," he mumbled. She waved away his thanks. No need to blush like a maid seeing her first cock. Realization dawned in her eyes. "Is that what has you so embarrassed?" "No need to worry so much, Sir Knight. As a healer, I've seen many such, and I know these things shrink in the cold. Perhaps now you're warm, I can better take your measure." She reached for the blankets, a wicked look in her eyes. Chase clutched them like his life depended on it. "I'll thank you to keep your eyes off my cock," he said hotly. Though now he thought about it, he wouldn't refuse if she put her hands on it. Rosa chuckled and returned to the table. "Ah, I've already seen it. You're a fine size, nothing to blush about. But if you're the modest sort, maybe you should cover it with the blankets when I check the stitches in your leg. They should come out soon, your leg is mending nicely." "You practiced sewing on my leg?" "Not so much practiced as stitched the flesh together so it would heal." She reached for the blankets again. "Here, I can show you if you like." "No." She shrugged. "Suit yourself then, Sir High and Mighty. I think I preferred you when you were unconscious. But now you're awake, I suppose you'll be wanting breakfast, so it's a good thing the hens laid plenty this morning." While Rosa busied herself with making breakfast, Chase risked a peep under the blankets. Bandages covered his right leg and encased most of his chest as well. Broken ribs, he guessed, and his head hurt something fierce too. He watched the woman bustling about, and another, more pressing question came to him. "How did you manage to save me?" he asked urgently. She was half his size. She couldn't have carried him out of there or fought off an entire pack of wolves. Rosa grinned. "Magic." "Magic doesn't exist," Chase said. Even he could hear the lie in his words. Rosa set both hands on her hips. "It doesn't, does it? Sir knows a lot." "Then how do you explain this?" "I was flying past when I heard a commotion in the woods, and when I came in close to see what was going on, I saw a man falling out of a tree in a fall so great it would have killed you. So I magicked you up beside me and flew you home here, so I could tend your wounds." People can't fly. This he was more sure about. She looked smug. "I can." That could not be true. "How did you carry me here then?" he challenged. She jerked her head at the corner where an old willow broom leaned against the wall. "Flew you back on my broomstick, of course. Don't you know that's how witches travel?" Come to think of it, he had heard of such a thing. But it was such an impossible idea, brooms that flew, he'd never given it thought before. "Truly?" he asked weakly. She shot him a look. "No, you daft thing. Sitting astride a broom is the stupidest thing I ever heard. Why, the wind would go right up my skirts and freeze the very core of me, it would. I'd need to bed a man every time I flew just to warm myself up again, and have no time for healing anyone." He had to admit, her words conjured up such a vivid picture that he was more than a little aroused. In fact, "Ooh, what a big—" "Don't say it," he begged, trying to cover the tent he'd pitched in his blankets. To her credit, she didn't laugh this time. Instead, she shrugged. "Suit yourself, Sir Chase the Chaste. Anyone would think you'd never bedded a woman before." She considered him for a moment. "When you're healed, I could introduce you to a couple of girls at the inn who might be able to help you with that." More images popped into his head, making him harder still. He gritted his teeth. "Please, Mistress Rosa, can we talk about something, anything else? I was already in enough pain before this, and now—" She blinked. "Oh, of course. You're about due another dose of medicinal. I almost forgot. I'll go down to the cellar and fill a jug. That should give you the time you need to take care of things. Oh, there's a bowl of water and a cloth beside the bed, so you can wash up after you're done, seeing as you're the modest sort who won't want my help with it." She winked as she knelt to lift up a trapdoor in the floor, then descended the steps until she was out of sight. Chase shook his head. What sort of woman talked about sex as brazenly as this one? Most of the women back home had been more modest. He didn't know what to think. One thing was for sure though, he'd never met a woman like her. 21. In the cellar, she sat down on a cask and laughed silently until tears streamed down her cheeks. So much for the brave and bold knights from her mother's stories, or even the show he'd put on for her that first morning. Perhaps she should not have kept him unconscious for 2 days, for she dearly needed a laugh. Then again, if she'd let him wake earlier, he'd have been in a lot more pain. She'd used a fair bit of magic to heal him while he'd slept, magic the man did not believe in. And strangest of all, he was the first man she'd ever met who wasn't eager to have a girl handle his man parts. So much for spending midwinter with the man. He'd probably shrink right up like a snail at the very thought. Impulsively she called out, "Are you finished, Sir Knight, or will you need a hand from me in finishing off?" "I'm fine. Just a moment," he shouted back in a fair panic. She headed deeper into the cellar, to where her grandmother had kept the casks of medicinal mead, stronger than the usual stuff and infused with healing herbs. Making more would take months, so she would have to be careful not to run out, but this would dull his pain better than the sleeping potions she'd given him before. She wouldn't mind a cup of mulled mead herself, come to think of it. There were plenty of ordinary barrels she might tap. The knight would not mind a few minutes more to himself either, she'd wager. When she finally climbed the stairs, the knight said, "You sure took your time." "I said I was finished a while ago." Rosa shrugged. "I didn't hear you." She set the jugs on the table. "I shouted loud enough for them to hear me in the village. Gods, what did you do to me? This hurts. I'd give my kingdom for some wine to dull the pain." She poured him a cup of the medicinal. "Try this. Then you'll owe me your kingdom, your majesty." He didn't take the cup. "I have no kingdom. Not even a horse now. What sort of knight does that make me?" "One who's going to drink his medicine so I don't have to listen to you complain." Rosa thrust the cup at him, then folded her arms across her chest until he drained it. "There. That'll knit your bones a little more, if the magic's still as potent as I remember. Maybe your ribs will heal by the end of the day." The knight choked. "That's not possible." With magic, almost anything is possible. For a price. A blood price usually, though she did not tell him that. This wouldn't be the first time she'd spilled blood for a stranger, nor would it be the last. His eyes narrowed. "You sound wise for someone who looks so young. How old are you?" "Centuries," she wanted to tell him, but suddenly she didn't want to play with him anymore. "I've seen 22 summers, but magic brings its own knowledge with it, wisdom from ages past. And witches learn young that power must be controlled or there will be consequences. You're younger than me. Younger even than Major was when." The knight closed his mouth abruptly. "Was Major your princess?" Rosa asked. The knight snorted. "Major was my sister. She died in childbirth." "I'm sorry," Rosa said automatically, then added, "Did the child die with her?" "No, the boy lives. In a royal court, ward to the queen no less. My brother-in-law could not have done better for his son." The knight shook his head. To mention royalty so casually, this knight must be highborn indeed. Ever so much higher than the baron's family. And he hadn't said that his sister wasn't a princess, perhaps she'd married a prince, for her child to join the royal nursery. What must he think of her, and this cottage? Why, the man must be used to castles and golden plates. No wonder he hadn't wanted to take her clay cup. She was lower than the servants who'd brought him breakfast in the morning. Speaking of which, I should do something with those eggs. Are you hungry, Sir Knight? Chase, he said. She mustn't have heard right. My name is Sir Chase. Call me Chase, he explained. Rosa nodded. He surely understood proper protocol better than she ever could. Breakfast, Sir Chase? Yes. I feel like I haven't eaten for days. Why, I could eat a whole horse. Did she dare mention his horse? His face fell before she'd opened her mouth. He remembered, then. Just Chase. I'm hardly a knight at all without a horse. How the mighty have fallen. He shook his head. Mistress Rosa, grateful though I am for your care and hospitality, I cannot repay you. The horse and what was in her saddlebags were all I owned in this world. Perhaps you should have left me to the wolves. She recognized the despair in his tone. Her spirits had sunk that low at times too. If you wish to offer payment, I'm sure you'll think of something suitable. I have helped far poorer patients than you, and they managed to find a way to show their gratitude. As for your horse, it seems to me the Baron owes you one, seeing as you lost yours in his service. Things are not so dark as they seem, Sir Chase. Your horse did not survive, but your saddlebags did. Your belongings are over by the window, and when you are well enough to leave your bed, you may have them back. He half rose. My cup. You have my cup? She rummaged through the bags until she found a metal cup. But when she drew it out, it glinted like it was made of gold. Not just golden plates. Golden cups too. This man was no ordinary knight. Thank you, Mistress Rosa. You don't know how much this means to me. It is all I have left of home, to remind me of them. His eyes turned pleading. Can you stow it safely away again? I don't want it damaged. She did as he bade her, wrapping it in the blanket that had covered it before. She busied herself with breakfast, but bread and eggs were nowhere near enough to stop her mind from wondering what sort of man the gods had brought into her home. Oh, he'd not harm her, she'd make sure of that, but whatever could bring a highborn knight, uncle to a prince if he was to be believed, to hunt wolves in her woods, must be a curious tale indeed. A tale that he would tell her, she resolved, before the winter was over. The least he could do after she saved his life. 22. Chase had tried sitting up while the girl was in the cellar, but his ribs had hurt so much, he'd lay back down again, heartily wishing he'd never heard of wolves or witches. Not that young Mistress Rosa was anything like he'd expected. Young and pert and far too knowing for one so young. Unless she'd lied about her age, but he doubted that. She liked discomforting him with the truth far too much. Nothing he said or did seemed to discomfort her, except when she'd seen the cup. Major's cup, that Abraham had turned to gold at a touch. If her eyes had taken on a greedy glitter at the sight of so much gold, he would not have been surprised, but she'd looked saddened. Disappointed, perhaps? So, out of respect for his hostess, he'd asked her to hide it again. Her good spirits had returned as she bustled about, stoking the fire and seeing to breakfast. She hummed a little as she worked, but it was no song Chase recognized. If he closed his eyes, he might be back in the kitchens of the castle where he and Abraham had fostered together, hoping for a treat from the cook before being sent back up to the great hall to serve at table as a good page should. But those days were gone, and Mistress Rosa's humble cottage would not yield the same fare as a castle kitchen. Likely he wouldn't see meat again until he was well enough to return to the Baron's house. He would find a way to repay her, he promised himself. Once he'd killed the wolf and received his reward from the Baron. Can you sit up? She asked, setting a plate on the table. She didn't wait for an answer, slipping an arm behind his back to lift him with unexpected strength. Chase gritted his teeth against the pain he expected, but it never came. He stared at her in surprise. That medicinal mead's powerful stuff, is it not? I told you it would heal you by dinner time. She winked. Ah, but there's no such thing as magic, is there? Her mischievous eyes dared him to admit he'd lied about believing in magic. She'd seen the cup. She knew. All the magic I've seen up till now has caused nothing but grief, so you'll forgive me if I am not so ready to believe it can be a force for good, he said, turning his gaze to his plate so that he might avoid those knowing blue eyes. Yet even the plate wasn't what he'd expected, for even the Baron's table had been set with trenchers of stale bread. And what lay upon it? Fried eggs, slices of some sort of spiced sausage, several slices of fresh bread, though there was no butter. He automatically looked across the table, even as he told himself he'd be lucky to get butter here. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. She grinned as she bit into a piece of bread, thickly spread with something white. She chewed and swallowed before she said, "I wasn't sure if you'd want cheese or butter with your bread, so I set out both." She pushed 2 bowls toward him. "I think I put too much honey in the ricotta, so it's sweeter than it should be, but I find a little extra sweetness in the morning is not such a bad thing." He stared at his plate. His belly growled at him to eat all that lay upon it, but he could not. "I cannot accept all this, for I cannot pay you for it. Mistress Rosa, I cannot in conscience let you empty your cellar for me. Please take some for yourself." She burst out laughing. "Sir Chase, if you ate 10 times that much you could not empty my cellar, not if you stayed here a year. No. You lost plenty of blood before I got you home, and you will need your strength. Mine will be ready soon, and then I'll join you." She headed over to the fire, tipping the contents of a pan onto her own plate. Not quite as much as she'd served him, but the sausage and eggs were plain enough to tell him he'd been mistaken about her. He waited no longer, taking up his eating knife to devour the food before him like he hadn't eaten in a week. Then again, he wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep. Healing yourself does work up an appetite, for magic can only do so much. The rest is up to you. There's more bread and I can fetch more sausage, but you'll have to wait until tomorrow for more eggs. Eat your fill, Sir Chase. She handled her eating knife with all the delicacy of a court lady. She didn't belong in a hovel on the outskirts of some tiny backwoods village. "Who are you?" he asked. "And what are you doing here?" She set down her knife, her eyes widening with surprise. "Why, Sir Chase, you must have injured your head worse than I thought. I am Mistress Rosa, the witch of these woods, and when you fell from a tree I rescued you and brought you here to my home to heal you. I thought to share a pleasant meal with you before I commence my work for the day, while you rest. But perhaps I should check your head first." She reached for him. Chase caught her wrist before she could touch him. "Not before you answer me. What have you done to me? How did I get here?" He became aware of something sharp pressed against his throat. He glanced down and found himself staring at the hilt of his own knife, floating in the air. "What are you?" he whispered. Her eyes seemed to glow. "I'm a witch who doesn't take kindly to threats. I may have saved your life once, but that doesn't mean I'll hesitate to take it back. Especially from such a poor guest, threatening your host when I have spent the last 2 days healing you. You're lucky I have a greater grudge against the wolves than the momentary irritation of the insult you've offered me." It was like facing Queen Margarita in the court of Arros all over again. Except this time he had nothing left to lose. Chase sagged. "Then I must beg your forgiveness, though I do not deserve it. Magic has meant ill luck for me at every turn, so that I cannot recognize anything else. I have nothing left to offer but myself, and I am poor compensation for anything. Yet, I pledge my sword and my honor in your service until my debt to you is paid." Custom required him to kneel and lay his blade at her feet, but he had no idea what had become of his blade, and if he tried to get out of bed, all he would do is fall at her feet. So he bowed his head and hoped it would be enough. At least if she refused, his death would be swift, for he could still feel the blade at his throat. "Now I know you have drunk too much of the medicinal mead. A high-born knight pledging himself to a witch? You must have mistaken me for your princess or someone else. I have no need of swords or service or men at all." But he could not feel the blade anymore. Rest and regain your strength, so chase. Maybe you'll regain your wits along the way. You may stay for the week, but then I must send you on your way back to the Baron." Her smile held sympathy, something else he did not deserve. Then she touched his forehead, and sleep engulfed him. Almost like some sort of spell.